during the war, during World War II, they made a twin-engine fighter bomber called the Mosquito, very famous aircraft of World War II. And that was made by de Havilland of Canada. And they saw the end of the war coming up, and they decided, well, what are we going to do after the war? So what they did was they sent a survey out to all the bush pilots up north and asked these guys, the guys who actually flew daily in and out of the bush, what do you guys want in the ultimate bush plane? And so with the survey, with the information they got back, the engineers came up with this. A lot of things that they incorporated in the design. For instance, this was designed to be a float plane from day one. It was never intended. The wheels were kind of an afterthought. As a matter of fact, when they about a week away from the test flight, they realized they were well inland. There was no water. They weren't on water anywhere. And one of the engineers, it occurred to them that, how are we going to get this thing in the air? So they were toying around with a dolly. They were just flying it off a dolly, etc., etc. But then they came up with this landing gear, very simple bungee cord type landing gear, and it's stood the test of time. So a lot of the stuff a lot of suggestions they incorporated. For instance, the fuel on this side is the fuel. The fuel tanks are in the belly. You got a forward, center, and aft fuel tank, 35, 35, and 25 gallons. They're right below the floor. And they do have, the only fuel on the wings are, you do have tip tanks on each side, and those take 21.5 gallons. Those feed the fuel selectors up above on the left side, above the pilot's head. And those gravity feed into the forward tank, I believe. So fuel management becomes an issue. You have to drain or get really low with the forward tank, and then you can reach up, and the gravity flows. You can select right, left. So you have to keep an eye on the fuel. There's no fuel gauges for the wing tip tanks, so you have to really kind of pay attention to. There's a gauge, a triple gauge, that has forward, center, and aft tanks on. You just have to really pay attention to that forward tank and pretty much get it empty before you start draining fuel from the tip tanks. We never fill the tip tanks on a regular basis in Alaska. You don't really need it, and it puts extra strain on the airframe. So unless it's a long ferry flight or something, we took when we came up to get our Beaver up from Sitka, so years ago, we filled the tip tanks, and that was pretty cool because you don't normally do that. So on this side here, look, if you come around here, I'll show you the fuel fill cap, or the fuel filler. Instead of getting up on the wings, they suggested, well, why don't you put the fuel in the belly, and that way you motor up to the dock, tie it up, and there's the fuel fill right there. You don't have to mess with balancing precariously on the wing or the strut. So there's your fuel filler caps. You have to be kind of careful with these because this thing is infamous for burping back. You can tell new Beaver pilots because they're filling gas, and certain tanks are, I can't remember which one. They're all kind of sensitive, but you'll be just pumping the fuel, and all of a sudden it'll just burp right back up at you because the fuel tanks are literally right under here, and the hoses kind of take different bends and stuff, so you have to be kind of careful when you're filling the fuel. But it's very handy. You can imagine on floats, you're standing on the float right here, motor up to the dock, and right like that. There's a very similar airplane called the Norden Norseman. As a matter of fact, when you see a photo of it, it looks you'd confuse it for a Beaver. It has the same lines, but you can tell there's something different about it. The Norseman was designed, that was like out of the 20s. It was mostly fabric, and it looked it looks a little cruder, because it was an earlier type of airplane. But it sat the same, and they got a lot of ideas from the Norseman. Let's see, the history of the thing. This one here is was built in 1952. It's actually a 1953 model, but it's built in 52. They built Beavers from 1947 to 1967. 67 was the last year of the Beaver. The engine that they used, the other interesting thing was these wings are extremely high lift. They were designing, the airframe guys at de Havilland were designing the airplane for a 300 horsepower engine, British engine. And about halfway through, and these other guys realized that's just kind of borderline. So these two guys, an airframe guy and an engine guy, were at coffee one day, and the engine guy talked the airframe guy. He said, "You know, these Americans have a slew load of these Pratt & Whitney R985s. They produce 450 horsepower, and they're cheap. You know, it was right after the war. They got thousands of them. So that's why this, to a great extent, that's what makes the Beaver the Beaver. It was designed for 300 horsepower, and it ends up with a 450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R985. Everybody knows what the R stands for? Radial, and 985?
9 jugs.
985 cubic inches. That's the cubic inch. Yep. And it does have 9 cylinders. Yep. The engine was, first run on the engine was 1929. So this is like aviation history right here. 1929 was the first time this engine ran, and then they built them up until 1960 something. 1929 and 1953 they built the R985. Parts are starting to get a little scarce, but so I want to show you the flaps. The thing about the Beaver is extremely high lift airfoil, big fat wings like a barn door. And what they did, because they were designing it again for that 300 horsepower, and to get maximum lift, they designed a mixing unit for the ailerons with the flaps. So the flaps actually, the ailerons droop with the flaps, and that's one of the secrets to the Beaver. And I'll show you the, let's see, flaps down. This one also has, one of the mods that they've done to the Beaver over the years is put electric flaps on it, and that's lame. Everybody loves manual flaps because they're quick acting. They're hydraulic in this case, but there's a manual lever. They're pretty quick acting. You're not going to believe the flaps this thing has. And notice the ailerons are coming down also on both sides. So that's
an airplane.
Yeah. I mean, you got like, what is that, 75 degrees? I don't know, it's ludicrous when you look at it. And the ailerons, there's a mixing unit, so both ailerons come down proportionally with the flaps. So you've got a tremendous amount of lift there with 450 horses up front. Nowadays we've gone to the Hamilton 3-blade constant speed, which was another improvement. Kenmore Air down in Lake Washington, in Washington State, owns a lot of the STCs for this, a lot of mods, a lot of improvements that they've made over the years. But you can only go so far to improve a Beaver, and we've kind of reached the pinnacle of Beaverness. This is pretty much it. The other thing they wanted was doors capable of, they put huge doors on it so that they could load 55-gallon drums into the cabin. So there's a lot of cargo there. This one here is a gross weight of 5,100, I think. I can't remember the useful load on it. With wheels and straight floats, you have a really nice usable load. The problem when there are amphibious floats, whip airs are really nice, amphibs. The problem with amphibs is, although you're adding a lot of weight because you've got 2 sets of landing gear built into the floats, you know, so you're really limited. Juno has an amphib, and there's one up here running around somewhere. I think we've got 6 left in the wing now, 6 or 7. But you're so limited on payload because of the weight of the landing gear built into the float. It's really handy because, you know, you can take off on the runway, do your water work wherever, land. Who's flown amphibs? Anybody here? Yeah, you guys know. Sweet. It's just the best of both worlds. It's all the fun of a boat and utility of a boat, but you're an airplane too, so it's great. But the thing is, especially in saltwater, at the end of the day, saltwater for us in Southeast Alaska, we're dealing with saltwater.